Well, hello there. I did promise I'd do that for Bethan. Um, yes, hello everyone. I thought I would bring the goth love, obviously, because like Christmas, I reckon, is actually a lot more gothic, than people like to admit. But I also want to bring some tales of my neck of the woods. And we've got the absolute lot up here. So we're going to start off with a ghost story. And I want to take you to Horton Castle, which is on the North Tyne, near Hexham. And that part of England is an interesting one historically because of the fact that it's where you would find border reivers. And border reivers are not as well known as they should be, but this is where you've got families on either side of the border who are essentially acting like the border isn't there. So you've got cattle rustling, you've got sheep theft, all that kind of stuff. Why it hasn't been made into a Netflix series yet, I don't know. But because it was such a lawless, violent, difficult time, you ended up where some lords were appointed by the crown to try and keep order, and they kind of did anything but. And they took bribes and would almost help the reivers. But then you got other um, landowners, like the hero in this story, Sir Thomas Swinburne, who actually wanted to do the best for the local families. And there was so much disruption caused by these constant cattle raids and so on that the local people went to Horton Castle and they went to Sir Thomas Swinburne and they were like, please, you've got to do something. This is really, really not working. We're losing money. We can't actually get anything done. You've got to do something about this. And Sir Thomas Swinburne promised he would do what he could, and as luck would have it, one Cardinal Wolsey was coming to York, which is about as far as he was ever likely to get to this neck of the woods, quite honestly. And he was like, I'll go and see Cardinal Wolsey, I'll put a case to him, we'll see what we can get sorted out. But before he went, he managed to capture Archie Armstrong, one of the more notorious of the Border Reivers. And yes, it is true that a descendant of the Border Reivers was the first man on the moon, which I find really quite funny. But the Armstrongs were very skilled, shall we say, at a lot of their shenanigans and skullduggery. So getting Archie Armstrong was quite the coup. So Thomas had him thrown into the dungeon. He's like, I'll deal with you when I get back from going to see Cardinal Wolsey. And he sets off to York. And he's a couple of days away from York when he sort of starts to think, I'm sure I've forgotten something, but I'm not quite sure what. But he just continues. And he's within sight of York when he realizes what he's forgotten. He still has the key to the dungeon and he hasn't left any kind of plans or any instructions for what to do with Archie Armstrong. And he feels awful about this because he's like, well, nobody's going to have done anything off their own initiative. I really need to sort this out. Like, this is awful. Like, this is such a mistake. So he completely forgoes going to see Cardinal Wolsey after all, and he absolutely tears back to Horton Castle as fast as he can because he's aware that he has his captive with no food, no water, nothing has been provided for this guy. And he gets back to Horton Castle, and everyone's really surprised to see him. And they're like, "Oh, what are you doing back so early?" And he's like, "Oh, I need to see the prisoner. Has anyone heard from him?" And they're like, "Not for the last couple of days, we haven't." So to Sir Thomas Swinburne's like, "Oh no, this isn't going to end well." And he goes down into the dungeon, and lo and behold, what should he find but the half-gnawed remains of Archie Armstrong? And he hadn't been eaten by rats; he'd been gnawing at himself out of hunger. So Sir Thomas Swinburne obviously feels awful about this anyway, but Archie Armstrong is not going to lie easy in such a situation. And this absolutely terrible howling begins in Horton Castle. It can be heard night and day. Sir Thomas can't keep staff. People just leave. It's absolutely awful. This sort of heartrending shrieking that just echoes almost through the stones itself that make up the castle. Eventually, Sir Thomas brings in a priest and he's like, we have to do something about this. And the priest is a bit stumped as to what to do. But he's like, I'll see what I can do. And he brings in a black book with him. Now, it's not immediately clear if this is a Bible or something else, but he brings this book in with him. And he goes into Archie's cell, or what was Archie's cell, and he speaks a few words of whatever his liturgy is that he thinks is going to help in this situation. And he sprinkles holy water around the place, and the screaming stops. So Thomas is obviously pleased about this, and the priest says, right, I've sorted the problem, but there's one catch. This book can't ever leave the castle. So he leaves Archie not Archie, he leaves Sir Thomas with the book, and the priest leaves because his work there is done. And Sir Thomas does as he's told, and he keeps the book in the castle. And then when he dies and the castle passes on to his descendant, they keep the book in the castle. And so it continues, and it becomes this thing around the castle that you have to keep this book, otherwise life just isn't going to be worth living. But unfortunately, books don't last forever. And despite the fact that this one is never interacted with, people sort of treat it like this holy object worthy of reverence. Despite all of this, eventually it still starts to drop to bits and the need to send it to a bookbinder. No sooner has it left the castle and headed off to the bookbinder, the shrieking starts. The screaming is every minute of every night and day, and it's just nobody can get any rest, nobody can get any peace. So the book is sent for and it is brought back without having actually been rebound, and everything seems fine. And the same thing happens again a few decades later because the owners again really want to get this book rebound. They send it away, and the minute it's left the house, it starts again. So basically, until this day, that book has never left Horton Castle again because everyone's terrified that were it to do so, Archie Armstrong would start screaming, reminding everybody about what happened to him at the hands of Sir Thomas Swinburne. So that is my first story for you. And I thought, well, how can I be more goth than screaming ghosts and exorcisms? And I thought vampires. And the North is really unusual in that we have not one, not two, not three, but four stories of vampires across the ages. Basically across Cumbria and Northumberland and also into the borders as well over in Scotland. And we know about three of them, and this is what absolutely fascinates me about this. We know of three of them because they actually appear in Historia Rerum Anglicarum, which is a history of England written by Canon William Newborough, who's a monk. And this particular set of books tells the history of England between 1066 and 1198. And it's book 5 where he starts talking about these particular three stories. And it's hilarious because of the fact that he sort of talks about all this ecclesiastical stuff that's a little bit dull. And then he suddenly goes, so yeah, there are vampires, and tells these three stories. And then immediately goes back to boring ecclesiastical business again, as if it's normal. But these three northern vampires happen in Berwick, which obviously is the northernmost tip of Northumberland, over in Melrose, which is in the borders, and in Alnwick, which in Alnwick Castle is obviously quite famous for being used in various films as a location. And I really want to focus just on the Alnwick one, purely because obviously Alnwick Castle is perhaps the most famous. And what's really funny about this is the fact that Canon William also tells us in this book that there are tons more vampire stories that he could have included. They're just sort of everywhere you move. So he's just had to narrow it down to these three. So I'd love to know what the other ones are. But anyway, Alnwick Castle, people are more likely to have been there. And this particular story takes place with a guy from Yorkshire who has actually travelled to Alnwick and made a name for himself. You know, he's worked his way up the ladder. He's doing really well, and he ends up in charge of Alnwick Castle, of all people. And he's not a very nice man, to be fair, but he's got a lot of money, he's got a lot of land. So obviously the next thing that he wants, he wants a wife. And trying very hard not to quote Jane Austen there. And he ends up marrying a woman who he essentially marries because she makes him look good. But he's convinced that if he finds her attractive, then other people must as well. So she must be betraying him. So he decides that he's going to spy on her. So he tells everyone that he's left the castle this particular day. He then goes and hides in the rafters of her particular chambers. And unfortunately, he's there for quite a while, and he gets tired, falls asleep, and drops out of the rafters, and obviously hits the floor with quite a hard thump. The floor not being particularly forgiving, he's then basically left with all these horrible internal injuries. So there's internal bleeding, there's bruising, you name it, he's probably broken it. And a priest is fetched, and the priest is like, this doesn't really look good. You might want to confess your sins. And the evil man goes, nah, it's all right, I'll do that tomorrow. But unfortunately, tomorrow never comes, and he dies during the night, having not confessed his sins. Because of the fact that he's still a man of some importance in the area, he's still given a Christian burial, but because he hasn't confessed his sins, he can't rest easily. So he starts rampaging around Alnwick on a night time, often accompanied by a pack of howling dogs. And everywhere that he goes, he leaves pestilence, and he's just causing disease and destruction and violence and all this kind of nonsense that really people didn't want to have to put up with. But nobody knew what to do about it because obviously this is obviously quite a strange thing to suddenly have happen, despite what Canon William might say. And eventually, two brothers decided they were so fed up with what was going on, they were going to deal with it. So they followed him back to his grave on this particular night, and obviously waited until dawn because they figured that they would be safe then, because that's when they'd be protected by the Lord. And they start digging into his grave, and immediately blood starts oozing out of the ground, and they're like, oh, this is not particularly fun. And they only get a few inches down, so instead of him being 6 feet down like he should be, he's actually just inches beneath the surface. So they dig him up, and he's fat and he's bloated, and he's basically as leech-like as you can imagine a human could possibly be. And they decide, right, okay, we're going to have to deal with this now because this is just disgusting. And in my head, I like to think of them as being like Shaun and Ed from Shaun of the Dead. But basically, they decapitate the corpse with a spade. They also cut out his heart and set fire to the corpse. And that thankfully ended up ending the reign of terror of the Alnwick vampire. And all things are put to bed. The same sort of ending happens with the Berwick and the Melrose vampires as well, but the Alnwick one is particularly interesting because it's these two brothers who take it on themselves to finally end it. And then as soon as he's finished that particular story, William of Newborough just continues talking about ordinary ecclesiastical stuff as if this is just an everyday occurrence in Alnwick. So I feel like I should end this the same way that Sir William does and just go, oh well, that was an interesting story. Now on with the show. And that is the end of my segment.